In this lecture, we're going to learn about dementia, one of the leading causes of death in Australia and across the world. By the end of this lecture, I hope that you'll get a broad understanding of what dementia actually is and how a person with dementia may perceive the world, the different types of dementia and the different diseases that can cause dementia, as well as looking into assistive technologies, which are specific technologies to help a person with their quality of life, maintaining daily living skills and independence. So firstly, what is dementia? Characterized by the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, the 5th edition. So what is dementia? Characterized by the Diagnostic Statistics Manual 5th edition. It's a group of symptoms characterized by impairment of at least 2 cognitive domains. Now, many people, when they think of dementia, they think that it is specifically a disease in itself, but it's not. It is a group of symptoms. Often, it is a group of symptoms caused by a disease underlying that. So there are 6 domains in total. So there's complex attention, executive ability, learning and memory, language, perceptual motor visual perception and praxis, whereby praxis is the planning of the perceptual motor or visual cues, and social cognition. So what is dementia? Dementia, classified by the Diagnostic Statistics Manual 5th edition. So what is dementia? Classified by the Diagnostic Statistics Manual 5th edition, it is a group of symptoms characterized by impairment of at least 2 cognitive domains. Now, many people think that dementia itself is a disease of its own, but it isn't. It's a classification of different symptoms caused by an underlying disease, affecting different cognitive domains, and these 6 domains are complex attention, executive ability, learning and memory, language, perceptual motor visual perception and praxis, which is the premeditated planning of these, and social cognition. And I'll go into each one of these domains shortly. So within the DSM-5, we have 2 classifications of mild neurocognitive dementia and severe neurocognitive dementia. Now, mild neurocognitive dementia is where the cognitive deficits themselves do not interfere with the independence of the person. So it might be that they're starting to get symptoms of, let's say, a bit of short-term memory loss, or they might be behaving or moving in a way that may not be normal for them, but it doesn't actually interfere with their ability to maintain independence and interact with the community as they normally do. Whereas where you have severe neurocognitive dementia, neurocognitive disorder, you then have a more advanced level of cognitive deficits which actually interfere with the independence of the person, and then needs assistance from either carers, technology, or potentially relocating into a residential care facility to assist the person in maintaining a quality of life and functioning in their day-to-day living. So firstly, what is complex attention? It involves sustained attention, divided attention, selective attention, and information processing speed. So these are all things that are important to be able to take in the world around us and interact accordingly. So a person that has dementia and has deficits in complex attention may start to get the warning signs that they are unable to easily operate or function in a room when there's a lot of distractions around and a lot of stimuli around them. So if the TV's on as well as the radio and a couple of people having a conversation in the other room, they may find it very difficult to be in that room and may start to get confused or start to get anxiety in there because they can't process it as easily. Other warning signs include difficulty holding and processing new information. So this is very much associated with your short-term memory. So for example, recalling phone numbers, addresses, or information that was just given to them immediately after it was given to them. So a person might give them their phone number, and then when asked to repeat it back, it's just out of mind. So what is it like to have these deficits? So from the voices of people with dementia, they can find places disorienting. They can find difficulties getting used to unfamiliar objects or routines. For example, when a person might move residential locations, they may find it a lot more difficult to adjust to the new environment that they're now living in because they don't have that routine that's already set up and familiarity with the world around them. And they're also likely to forget where basic things are, such as potentially where the toilet is or where they've put their mug, or little objects around the house, which usually they would have specific places for and now no longer remember where it might be if it's misplaced. The second domain is executive ability. So this involves planning, decision-making, working memory, responding to feedback, error correction, overriding habits, and mental flexibility. These are all very complex processings that happen around your frontal cortex. So warning signs of this is that a person may be unable to perform both familiar or complex tasks and projects at work and at home. So that might be things that involve very fine-tuned understanding and movement and skill. They may need to rely on others to plan instrumental activities of daily living or make decisions for them. So that might be that they're unable to know what they're getting up to throughout the day, what tasks need to be done, and they need to have a lot of scheduling done for them. Or they might have problems with abstract thinking and displaying a loss of initiative, as well as poor decreased judgment. So they slowly start to lose the ability to, especially when it comes to things of safety, be able to make judgment calls of how to interact with whatever might be in front of them. So for example, if they're boiling a kettle, they might not understand that they have to put water in the kettle to then put it on, which causes a lot of issues in potentially over boiling the kettle, which becomes dangerous. So what's it like to have dementia with a deficit in this area? We can find abstract notions like money and value confusing. So it's very difficult to process things such as the value of money. For example, one of the participants I have worked with myself had issues, for example, going to an ATM and withdrawing money. And when she wanted to only withdraw $50, she ended up 3 times going back to the machine and withdrawing $500 at a time, which is when there needs to start to be limits on withdrawal amounts. And you can also understand how people can be very much taken advantage of in these situations as well. We can find the results of actions hard to predict, so a cause and effect of what your actions are, doing one thing and understanding the consequences of those. And we can misunderstand the pattern on the floor. So there might be something on the ground in front of them, it might be a tile display, and it may become very confusing because they're unable to easily process the detailed information that is there. Learning and memory as another domain involves immediate memory, recent memory, free recall, cued recall, and recognition memory, and long-term memory. So warning signs that a person might repeat themselves in a conversation, often within the same conversation. They can often recall the same topics or say the exact same thing multiple times. They're unable to keep track of short lists of items when shopping or of plans for the day. So often you'll find that a person with dementia, when they go to the shops, they won't remember what they need to buy, but they'll end up getting items that they frequently stock up on because they don't believe that they have them at home. So once again, I've worked with a participant who at home, instead of often getting sponges or something that they need, every single time they go, they end up getting dishwashing liquid, and then they start hoarding that. And other warning signs may be that they require frequent reminders to orient tasks at hand, confusion about time and place, and have repetitive behavior. So what's it like to have this? People with dementia say that they can forget where they put things quite easily. Unfortunately, often when things are forgotten where they're put, a person with dementia may not understand that they've forgotten where they put it, and this often turns to blaming others around them that their item has been stolen or somebody else might have taken it. They can forget where they've been doing, they can forget what they've been doing recently. For example, a person might think that they have had lunch when they haven't, and vice versa. They may have lunch twice because they've forgotten that they've already had lunch. They can forget people's names, even people close to them, and these are often at the later stages of dementia where family will go and see them and they no longer recognize their partner or their children. And they can forget that they've done something, and so they repeat the same thing, or they repeat saying the same thing. And also that the strongest memories may be from events from the past. So this is associated with what's called retrograde amnesia, where a person with dementia will often remember things from their childhood and earlier on in life, but they forget things that had happened a lot more recently, and it gradually declines that way. So, you know, from a few weeks ago to then losing memory of what happened a couple of years ago, but they'll still retain those earlier memories in life, and often to incredible detail. The fourth area and domain is language, so involves expressive language, naming, fluency, grammar and syntax, and receptive language. So this is often when there's dementia in the temporal cortex of the brain. So warning signs of this is that people with dementia may have significant difficulties with expressive or receptive language. They may not understand what's being said to them. They may find it very difficult to speak back and say what they want to say. They struggle being able to capture words or understand the lexical nature of a word, the meanings behind it. Often they use general terms such as that thing, or you know what I mean, to try to cover it up or to communicate when they have forgotten. They'll often use specific nouns or repeated object itself in replacement of what they've also forgotten. With severe impairment, they may not be able to recall names of closer friends and family. And as you can see, there's a bit of overlapping here between some of the domains where they may not be specifically to one area, but the deficits themselves are associated with multiple domains. What's it like to have this dementia? So people often may forget words. They often forget the names of things. They may use a certain word or phrase often in compensation. They can sometimes say things that do not make sense in the conversation. So it may start out fine and then all of a sudden it goes into a completely different area, or the actual sentence does not make grammatical sense. They may take longer times to process what has been said and what to respond to. And they may switch over to potentially a native language if they're bilingual in the middle of a conversation. And that's quite common that a person, for example, if their native language is Chinese, but English is their second language, and they start getting dementia, that they'll start bringing Chinese into their English sentences and start reverting to their native language. And as mentioned, that their sentences just may not make any sense whatsoever. The fifth domain is perceptual, motor, visual, perception, and praxis. Once again, the premeditated planning of these. It involves picking up the telephone, handwriting, using a fork or spoon, so very behavioral actions as well. So warning signs may be that the person has significant difficulties with previously familiar activities, using tools or driving a motor vehicle, and also navigating in familiar environments. Often this is also linked in with other things such as planning. So it depends on where the actual difficulty and barrier in the execution of these actions take place. So is it actually in the ability to look at an item and understand what that item is used for, which is quite common with these perceptual issues. Or it might be the fact that they know that there's a hammer in front of them, but they don't actually understand how to use the hammer or how to go about using it. What's it like to have this? They need good lighting to give them as much information as possible about their surroundings. So often, sometimes with also visual loss, one of the steps to try to help a person navigate through their house might be putting fluoro markers on everything that they're meant to use, or on the tap or on the fridge handle, just to increase the contrast of their environment around them and to provide them with more information and to highlight what it is that they need to use. It makes them more and more dependent on all of their senses. So as you start losing your senses in one area, they start to need to communicate with the world using other senses. So if hearing starts to go, they may rely more heavily on their eyesight and vice versa. If their eyesight starts to go, they might have to rely more heavily on their touch and what they can feel around them to indicate if they've got the right object. They may need to be able to see, smell, and feel things in order to feel confident in engaging in that activity. They may also get agitated if they get too hot, which is a common one, also because people with dementia can also feel quite cold. They'll be in different environments where a person without dementia feels that the temperature is fine, but then a person with dementia is starting to feel cold constantly. And they may get confused if there's not enough light, which is where having sufficient light is one of the major, I guess, things that you can do to help a person navigate their environment around them. And the last domain is social cognition. So it involves recognition of emotions and behavioral regulations, social appropriateness in terms of dress, grooming, and topics of conversation. So that is a lot to do with the inhibition of certain behaviors or what might be said, where a person may start acting in a way that isn't deemed socially acceptable. So, for example, I had a participant in one of my research studies where throughout conversations they would start barking or quacking and having these what would normally be unsocial etiquette, for instance. So warning signs are patients may have changes in behavior. They show insensitivities to social standards or make decisions without regard to safety. And they may also have little insight into how these are changing and become socially withdrawn or isolated. So what's it like? They can find large groups difficult to handle. Often it may bring a lot of anxiety with it when in a room full of people or meeting new people. Yep, they can become anxious in situations where they coped well beforehand. Too much noise may confuse them. It may make them very sensitive to built or social environments, feeling claustrophobic in those areas. They can be very sensitive to the emotional atmosphere, and therefore they benefit from a calm environment and less stimulation. So in general, when looking at dementia, there are often 12 neuropsychiatric presentations that are measured to try to understand what is happening in each of these domains. Now, this is usually measured by what's known as a neuropsychiatric inventory, and there's also a neuropsychiatric inventory for nursing home version. It was originally created by Cummings et al. In 1994, and it is commonly used to try to understand where a person is at in terms of these 12 domains and to track their progress over time to see the advancements in any of the deficits potentially in these areas or behavioral changes. So the 12 areas are delusions, hallucinations, agitation and aggression, dysphoria and depression, anxiety, euphoria and elation, apathy and indifference, disinhibition, irritability and liability, aberrant motor behavior, and the two which were only later actually added into these domains is nighttime and sleep behavior and appetite and eating. Now, these are generally scored by a carer or a person who is quite familiar with the person with dementia, and gives not only a rating of the severity of these, but also the impact that these behaviors have on the carer themselves. So now I just want to show you a brief video of what does a person with dementia see in their day-to-day. And this is a very singular example. As I said, everybody is very unique and different, especially in the symptoms that they have in the presentations. But just to give a little bit of insight into a person with dementia and how they interact with the world.
The sun rises tomorrow morning from 7 o'clock here on 107.9 FM.
It's not raining. Good.
What? I've forgotten. Should I?
Just
I
both
put-
sit down. Just
Oh.
both sit down.
Yeah. Right. Oh, that way. I don't know what. Oh, I don't know. Could you please? Oh. It's my list. Shall I go? So I don't know quite what. Oh dear. Chicken cheese.
What?
Chicken cheese?
Sorry.
Oh. Oh. I don't know. People with dementia have experiences like this every day. A little bit of understanding, tolerance and patience can make all the difference.
I'll tell you what, if you go into the seats just there,
Right.
when we get there, I'll call you, okay?
Okay, madam.
I can't get on.
Let me help you. This way.
Thank you.
Can I have a look at that list?
Yes.
Chicken and cheese.
Oh,
Let's go this way.
thank you. Find out how to become dementia friendly. Contact Alzheimer's Society. Today.
Alright, so I just wanted to show that video to give a bit of a demonstration of the little things that happen throughout the day, because it's important that us in society understand what dementia is, the impact that it has on our generally older population and how they can present, because it's very easy to mistake a lot of what an older person may do as just being older age, but realistically it can be dementia. And without that understanding and just brushing it off brings in other issues of ageism, where, you know, we all have a responsibility to try to take care of, I guess, the society around us and to interact with them to make it easier and just to have that little bit of understanding. Now, in that video, little things that I'd like you to go back if you didn't notice them was, for example, putting, I think it was the tea jar into the fridge and different items in the home into different areas, forgetting when on the bus what to do or where she wants to go, of having great difficulties in high stimulating environments that caused anxiety, not being able to read her shopping list properly and misunderstanding what the actual items were. And it's these little things and deficits in the cognition and processing and perception of the world around that makes it that much more difficult, frustrating and confusing for a person with dementia to successfully go about their day. And you know, it can be a very lonely, confusing, upsetting disease to have, especially in the earlier stages when people are a lot more conscious of these deficits coming into play. Now, for the next part of this, I'd like to now talk about dementia in the brain and the different major types of diseases that cause dementia. So dementia itself is caused by damage to brain cells and the communication of neurons in the brain. Now, we have all these different areas of the brain generally dedicated to certain processing. So we've got our frontal lobe, which is a lot to do with planning and personality, as well as your general motor association areas. We've got and there's also, language areas there, especially Broca's area, which is about expressive language. We've got our temporal lobe, which is more to do with the processing language and auditory area, such as your hearing input, facial recognition, auditory association areas. You've got your parietal lobe, which is your primary somatosensory area, general sensory association areas, understanding language, which overlaps with the temporal lobe there. So you can see how language, interestingly, is very much represented across different areas of the brain to make all of it successful, whether it's the processing or the production of it. We have the visual association area, which is at the back with our visual primary cortex, and then at the bottom we have our cerebellum, which is a lot to do with our motor behavior, and our brainstem. So different types of dementia often affect different areas of the brain, and eventually they progress to affecting all of the brain, but we'll soon see with the different types how they interact with the brain to be able to come with different symptoms and to be able to be classified as these different diseases. So the most common causes of dementia, there's over 100 diseases that cause dementia, which is phenomenal. But the most common is Alzheimer's disease, which has roughly a 60 to 80% prevalence. We then have vascular dementia, which is to do a lot with the blood supply to the brain. We then have Lewy body disease and frontotemporal dementia, and that, as you can tell from the name, is a lot to do with our frontotemporal areas. And there are many others, but what is also quite common is to have mixed domains. So a person with Alzheimer's disease may also have vascular dementia, where it's not just the tau proteins and the amyloid plaques that build up, it is also the lack of blood supply in there for oxygen or glucose to the brain. But we'll get into that shortly. So Alzheimer's disease itself is very much characterized by amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles in the brain. So here you can see that we've got a neuron, and a neuron is made up of what is your dendrites at the end of our neural body here, and then we have our axon that gets extended out, and that actually communicates with other neurons. So what I'd like to do now is show you a very short video again, but on Alzheimer's disease, just to give a little bit of a broader understanding on what it is.
And language problems. As more in healthy people, all sensations, movements, thoughts, memories, and feelings are the result of signals that pass through billions of nerve cells or neurons in the brain. Neurons constantly communicate with each other through electrical charges that travel down axons, causing the release of chemicals across tiny gaps to neighboring neurons. Other cells in the brain, such as astrocytes and microglia, clear away debris and help keep neurons healthy. In a person with Alzheimer's disease, the most basic form of dementia, toxic changes in the brain destroy this healthy balance. These changes may occur years, even decades, before the first signs of dementia. Researchers believe that this process involves two proteins, called beta amyloid and tau, which somehow become toxic to the brain. It appears that abnormal tau accumulates, eventually forming tangles inside neurons. And beta amyloid clumps into plaques, which slowly build up between neurons. As the level of amyloid reaches a tipping point, there is a rapid spread of tau throughout the brain. But tau and beta amyloid may not be the only factors involved in Alzheimer's. Other changes that affect the brain may also play a role over time. The vascular system may fail to deliver sufficient blood and nutrients to the brain. The brain may lack the glucose needed to power its activity. Chronic inflammation sets in as microglial cells fail to clear away debris, and astrocytes react to distressed microglia. Eventually, neurons lose their ability to communicate. As neurons die, the brain shrinks, beginning in the hippocampus, a part of the brain important to learning and memory. People may begin to experience memory loss, impaired decision-making, and language problems. As more neurons die throughout the brain, a person with Alzheimer's gradually loses the ability to think, remember, make decisions, and function independently. Achieving a deeper understanding of the molecular and cellular mechanisms and how they may interact is vital to the development of effective therapies. Much progress has been made in identifying various underlying factors. Advances in brain imaging allow us to see the course of plaques and tangles in the living brain. Blood and fluid biomarkers are providing insights about when the disease starts and how it progresses. More is also known about the genetic underpinnings of the disease and how they can affect particular biological pathways. These advances enable the development and testing of promising new therapies, including drugs that reduce or clear the increase of tau and amyloid proteins in the brain, therapies targeting the vascular system, glucose metabolism, and inflammation, and lifestyle interventions like exercise or diet, and behavioral approaches like social engagement that may enhance brain health. Research is moving quickly, ever closer to the day when we can delay or even prevent the devastation of dementia.
So hopefully from that video you'd be able to gain a little bit of an understanding of Alzheimer's disease and the role of amyloid plaques, as well as tau protein in, unfortunately, cell death and what actually happens to the neurons. So as you can see here, we do have a neuron where we have the cell body of the actual neuron. We then have these little things called dendrites, which help to communicate with other neurons in the brain. And we have an axon which travels all the way down and goes towards the axon terminals, and those axon terminals then interact with the dendrites of other neurons. Now within the axon itself, which often has what are called myelin sheaths on it to help with very fast communication, but within the actual axon we've got these microtubules, and we've got normally tau proteins that help assist all of this communication. But what happens in Alzheimer's disease is that we get these amyloid plaques that build up, and there is issues basically with the tau protein and the processing of them and the functioning of them, which causes the neuron itself to become diseased and die off. And as a result of this, where these axons are often a lot within the white matter of the brain, which is, you know, the brain itself has your cerebral cortex, which is our gray matter around the outside, which is where all the processing happens. Then we have this white matter on the inside, which allows the different areas of the brain to communicate with each other. So the white axons here of this area of the brain might stretch and interact then with this side of the brain for different processing purposes. So in a healthy brain, it's very plump. It's, you know, there's a lot of matter there. But then with mild Alzheimer's disease, you can start to slowly see here we've got our hippocampus and shrinkage over there. We've got enlarged ventricles that start to happen because of the cell death around it. And that's even more profoundly experienced here in severe Alzheimer's disease, where you really start to get the severe shrinking, especially of the cortical shrinking, severely enlarged ventricles, and severe shrinkage of the hippocampus. Now here, if you see sort of comparison of scans of a normal brain to Alzheimer's diseased brain, is you can really see that in play where we've got our enlarged ventricles here, we have much less white matter, a very deforming of the actual shape and look of the brain as atrophy has happened and cell death of the brain has occurred. Here we can see that with different Alzheimer's disease, there are actually, we can do different positron emission tomography scans. And this allows us to be able to scan for certain biomarkers in the brain. So here we've got different, this is our structural MRI where we can see differences in the brain that happens with cell death, with the atrophy. We can look at through PET scans glucose metabolism and where there might not be as much glucose metabolism compared to a normal healthy brain, which can often indicate, that there is a shortage in the blood supply there, or there isn't something that's happening properly. Your amyloid beta plaques, your beta proteins, your tau proteins. You can see different forms of neuroinflammation, as well as your synaptic density. And that is the density of the neurons that are in the brain and how much that shrinks to be able to have less activity. So you can see in all of this that there is more activity in the darker areas and less activity in the bluer areas. The next type of dementia, which is our second leading cause of dementia, is vascular dementia. And this is all to do with the impaired blood circulation to the brain and within the brain. It often comes from the narrowing or a complete blockage of blood vessels in the brain, and often happens from things such as a heart attack, a stroke, if you have high blood pressure, diabetes, or high cholesterol. But there are different types of vascular dementia, which I won't get into too much detail. But in the right-hand side image here, we can see that, for example, in our A image here, we can see that there are a lot of what are known as white matter lesions. And that's pointed by the arrows here. So that is, issues in those areas. We've got here the arrows are indicating large cortical infarction, which is basically cell death from issues that occur, and blood. So here on the right hand side, we've got an image that shows different characteristics of what can happen with vascular dementia. So in our A image here, we've got what are white matter lesions of greater than 25%. And these lesions often happen from trauma in the brain or from the disease itself. And, it's a build-up in itself of... And here in the beep. So here in the right-hand side of the screen, we can see 4 different images, each representing different characteristics that can actually occur in vascular dementia. So in the top left-hand side, we've got arrows indicating to an area that has extensive, which is greater than 25% white matter lesions, which is death in those areas of the brain, or I guess a very severely damaged area of the brain. This can often happen from from the lack of blood supply to those areas. So here on the right hand side of the screen, we have 4 different images of characteristics that can occur with vascular dementia. In the top left hand side here, we have arrows indicating to a greater than 25% area of white matter that has lesions. And these lesions themselves is the damaged tissue that can occur from, for example, disease or from traumatic brain injury, but in itself affects the supply of blood throughout the brain. In B here, we've got the arrows indicating large cortical infarction, which is a limitation in the supply of blood to a certain area. As you can see here, that's really deformed, this left-hand part of the brain compared to the right hand as in a comparison. And it's often, a partial or full obstruction of blood supply to that area. In the bottom left-hand side here, we have the arrows indicating some microbleeds. So where blood vessels in the brain are escaping different veins also that are bringing the blood supply. And here in D, we've got arrows that indicate multiple lacunar infarcts, which are white matter lesions, basically, of the brain, and areas that can build up within the brain and cause, once again, obstruction to the blood supply. And in D over here, we have the arrows indicating multiple lacunar infarcts, which are areas of cell death due to the lack of blood supply in the areas of white matter in the brain. So next is some little diagrams just to see how the supply of blood to the brain can get disrupted. You know, here we've got microbleeds where through the veins or the arteries there's a breakage and the blood supply gets released, which causes bleeding in the brain. We've got small vessels which can cause a buildup or a blockage that can occur within these and here we've got small vessel ATS, which is basically just bulging that occurs in the membrane of the veins or arteries into the supply of the blood. We have here leukoareosis, if I can say that properly, which is lacunar infarcts, which is what we went over before, which is just the buildup of areas of cell death in the white matter of the brain, and this can often caused by these deposits that happen in the membrane of the wall, or the thickening of the cell wall, which causes the actual blood supply to reduce in allowing the blood supply to actually go through, the cell walls to inflame to reduce the blood supply coming through. We've got bilateral carotid arteries, so there might be this bulging that occurs that stops the blood supply through one of the areas. You know, there's here small vessel occlusions, which also occurs with certain bulging that can completely block the blood supply and cause microinfarcts, which once again, you know, is cell death in the brain there due to a lack of oxygen, due to a lack of blood. We then have Lewy body dementia. So Lewy body dementia similarly is an issue with proteins in the brain, but it is a buildup of Lewy body proteins, specifically in neurons, which are very, very tiny abnormal proteins. The initial signs can be difficulty walking, a decrease in balance and the ability to control physical movements. Visual hallucinations are common, especially with the early progression of Lewy body dementia. And you also get a lot of issues with your rapid eye movement, sleep, behavior, a dysfunction where people physically act out the situation of their dreams. Now, this is where you can start to see with the different types of dementia how the symptoms themselves can often indicate what type of dementia it is. Though don't let that confuse you in thinking that it's very definite, because there's a lot of issues out there of being diagnosed not with the correct type of dementia, and it's only with the later progressions and as other symptoms start to arise does there become more light into the situation of what actually might be happening and what's going on. So as you can see that Lewy body dementia itself has a lot of issues with behavior and with the visual hallucinations that can come. So the Lewy bodies, we have here sort of three different diagrams of the progression. So in kind of the first stages, we've got autonomic and olfactory disturbances. So, you know, smelling might be disturbed, they might lose it, they might have odd smelling sensations. You get brainstem Lewy body buildup where the proteins are in the brainstem, and that's when these start to happen. They then can, you know, move up and around in our olfactory bulb, which is where you're getting the smell issues that are coming in, but it also mostly, you know, with your brainstem, we've got issues there with our motor symptoms. And as it slowly starts to build up in the cortical areas of the brain, we move into, you know, our sleep and motor disturbances, and then into emotional and cognitive disturbances, where it starts to become more globally through the brain. We then have frontotemporal dementia. Now, it is most commonly hereditary type of dementia. So unlike the other types of dementia, which yes, there are some evidence towards it being hereditary in some ways, it's often they haven't really found specific causes or whatnot, but frontotemporal dementia is predominantly a hereditary type of dementia, and often comes a lot earlier in the lifespan, so 40s, 50s, rather than later on in your 70s, which is common for Alzheimer's. It affects your personality, emotions, behavior, executive functioning, and speech. Now, frontotemporal dementia has 3 different types of variants. The most common is your behavioral variant, frontotemporal dementia, which affects personality and behavior. Now, it's quite common for a person to really maintain their short-term memory and their memory in general, but their personality starts changing a lot. They no longer seem like the person that they used to be. They may start to no longer have the same social inhibitions that were there beforehand. They might become very angry very quickly, start to lose all motivation and become quite apathetic, have depression. All these different signs of personality and behavior changes are quite related to frontotemporal. You also have primary progressive aphasia, which first affects your speech and then behavior. And then progressive non-fluent aphasia, which causes loss of the ability to recall and speak words. So in general, there's a maintenance of language skills and memory until the later in the disease, though eventually it does become global like all the others and affect everything. So here, when you're looking at Alzheimer's disease compared to frontotemporal dementia, Alzheimer's is really heavily affecting these kind of more temporal and visual cortex areas of the brain and the hippocampus, whereas frontotemporal dementia first begins around the frontotemporal areas of the brain, as well as, here the temporal areas to cause these symptoms. Now we're going to look into assistive technology for people with dementia. And assistive technology is important because it allows a person with dementia to maintain their daily living skills to the best of their ability, to be at home for as long as possible, to give help and assurance to carers and the people looking after them, particularly in terms of safety, where they might be, and to generally give a person a way to maintain identity and, as I said, really independence. So there's all different types of assistive technology that's out there. You've got wearable devices such as watches, pendants and necklaces, which often track somebody's GPS, where they are located. Wandering is quite a big issue, where people get up in the middle of the night and leave their house and start wandering around the street, to their family members waking up and not knowing where they are, to having fall sensors and detectors, because falling is very common. And especially, the danger of a person wandering out into the street who may not longer remember who they are, is they get picked up by the police or someone, and it's, where do you live? What is your name? If they can't remember any of this, what do you do with this missing person? So you've got things such as a wearable device that is worn as a wrist watch or just as a wrist pendant or something, which cannot easily be taken off, as often people with dementia will fiddle around. They'll want to take things off their body, whatever it might be, and allows the ability for, if a person was to be picked up on the street, to give them a number or something of a family member. You've got handheld devices, tablets, GPS trackers that are handheld, fitness trackers, smartphones, all the rest. And handheld devices play a bigger role in terms of sort of cognitive training, different games that people can play, reminders, scheduling, alarms, those type of things. We also then have mobility aids. So people in wheelchairs with built-in sensors. So there's some wheelchairs that people can go into where if they fall off the wheelchair, it will spark a sensor, call emergency services, whatever it might be. One of my participants themselves had a watch that she would often wander, but her daughter was the only carer of her, and her daughter would have to work. And so the daughter would be out and the mother would go out, and she'd be wearing this wristwatch, and she wasn't meant to leave the house. So every time she left the house and she started wandering around the streets, it would actually turn a camera on, and it would allow her daughter to speak to her immediately, saying, Mum, you've left the house. It's time to turn away. I can help direct you back into the home. You've got voice-activated assistants, Siri, Alexa, Google Home. One of my current participants at the moment uses that religiously. She's got a very atypical type of dementia. They're not 100% sure what it is. She has great cognition, but her issues come into the effect of body sensations. So she's very incontinent, doesn't know when she needs to go to the toilet, doesn't know when she's thirsty, doesn't know when she's hungry, which is one of the biggest issues because people with dementia will forget to drink water, and hydration is a massive problem, dehydration that is. So she has an Alexa around the house that gives her reminders and sparks all throughout the day to tell her it's time to eat, go to the fridge and make yourself a sandwich. And it has feedbacks that it won't just tell her that because she can easily forget it, but she has to perform certain actions, and it'll be able to use sensors to track what she's actually doing. We have distributed systems such as smart homes with integrated sensor systems for light, heat, and window covering. So these are very expensive but amazing technology. It's not very accessible because of the expense of it, and you need to install this into a person's home. But you have things that will track the temperature in the house and where the person is in the home, and the lighting in a room, and help give directions and actions, and really be able to track a person's movement. So if all of a sudden, the person is in bed all day and they don't leave and they're not going to the fridge at all, that it will be able to pick this up and alert with the sensors. And then you also have situation-specific robots who can do things such as floor cleaning, lifting, soothing, and emotional responses. So this can become quite a social assistive technology for people with dementia, where you might get a cat, a social cat that goes around a aged care facility, or a person might have one at home. And one of my participants, for instance, had a social cat, and she was at the point where she would communicate with it, she would pat it throughout the day, she would talk to it, and it provided a lot of comfort, and that sociability that may otherwise not have been able to be there with the people in her life. So in terms of assistive technology, now a lot of the problems that are out there with assistive technology is that they're very complicated to use. It might be a wristwatch that's too heavy for a person to wear, or they might easily break things. If it's a device that is easily transportable, it could easily get lost around the house. Different things like this, there's a lot of considerations. And at Western Sydney Uni at the moment, one of the projects that I'm working on is we're actually designing assistive technology from scratch for people with dementia, and taking in a lot of the hardware and software recommendations that are out there, keeping in mind that every individual person is so unique in their needs and in the stage that they're at with their dementia. So certain do's, it's important to have direct interaction with the device. So that's then using less cognitive resource required to really perform actions with the device. As soon as you have a remote control or a mouse, you're causing extra brain processing to be able to map what a mouse is doing onto the screen. And it's adding that level of complexity to the situation. Large surfaces are important, especially for reduced hand dexterity, which comes, with the motion issues, and as well as small screens are harder to read and to interpret and understand. And it's important to have a mounted device, as I said, not handheld, because things can easily get lost. We also have our don'ts. So don't include buttons that are not intuitive or labeled. Previous research has shown that using a mouse that has buttons that aren't labeled just confuses, or having a spin wheel on the mouse causes a person to start playing around with that and losing concentration on what's actually happening. Indirect interaction with the interface, as I said, can cause mapping issues. So using a mouse and then tracking where that mouse is on the actual screen, and then knowing what to do. Portable devices are not ideal as they can get lost, and handheld touchscreen devices increase risk of triggering undesired functions. So problem with a lot of iPads is you've got all the buttons around the outside. As soon as a person is using it and they're pressing buttons that they may not understand what they're actually doing in terms of pressing those buttons, they've done something, they don't know what they've done, they don't know how to undo that behavior, it becomes very frustrating to use. We then have interface recommendations. So certain interface recommendations are using voice and touchscreen activated, and this, once again, all of this depends on the individual. But some people might have problems with hearing, some people might have problems with speaking, some people might have problems with touch. So all these things, a multimodal device is a lot more recommended than any other type of device to try to account for, as we mentioned earlier, the differences in having to use all your sensory to be able to engage with what's around you. Simple designs with images, simple text and voice and music reminders. So everything has to be very simplistic. Having multiple things on a screen is just confusing. So even recently in some of the research we're doing, we're finding that images that are icons are actually more effective than real life photographs, because you get a lot of noise in a photograph, of background noise, where in an icon you can have very high contrast images where certain parts stand out and you can communicate that. So using large images and large font sizes and text, there is research out there saying that there's a color preferences. So blue is more preferable to red, to green, to yellow, to purple, to orange, to brown. So it's important to try to incorporate these certain things into technologies for people with dementia. It's important to have user feedback and confirmation for task completion. So when somebody has done something, how do you actually know that they've done it? Is there a way to censor that they've actually put water into the kettle, or are they able to say, yes, I have filled up the kettle, what is the next step in this sequence? And also familiarity and minimal interface options. Familiarity is important in terms of using language that a person will know. There's no point saying go to Google Chrome if a person doesn't know what Google Chrome is. And this is a very difficult thing in general with older adults and people with dementia, is using language that the younger generations are so accustomed to, but the older generations unfortunately don't have that same linguistic background. So saying to someone, go back to the desktop, go home, they may not be able to comprehend what that actually means. So using language that they are able to work with. And minimal options it's better to have a yes or a no option rather than, several different ways of doing something. Certain don'ts. It's important, for example, to have all necessary information to be displayed at once. Don't expect a person to be able to retain information from one screen to the next screen. So if you're doing a sequence of tasks, every step of that sequence has to give all the information that is necessary to perform that action. Too many distractors. If there's multiple animations or bright colors or loud noises on a screen, it can become very confusing, cause anxiety, and be quite distracting. A person can easily be in the middle of performing a task and then they notice something flashing and then that task is completely out of their mind. To minimize the time limits to actions is important. So, for example, a lot of the time screens may turn off after 30 seconds of inactivity, but a person with dementia often functions at a slower rate, and in that way need a bit more time to be able to perform tasks successfully. So it's better not to have these time limits. As well as the use of symbols that may not be understood. So similar to the language and the familiarity of what I was saying, a person may not know that the red X in the top left-hand side means close off the current window, because they may not understand that there's a window behind or anything like that. So it's important to give direction and specific verbs within actions displayed. And finally, we're going to look at the personalizations of user experience and more just talk about. And finally, we're going to just discuss the importance of the personalizations of user experience. Now, we've mentioned that a person with dementia may have very unique and finally, we're now going to just touch on the personalization of the user experience. We've already said that people with dementia all come across with very different symptoms and the way and the stages that they're at and the different capacities and capabilities at a specific time. So no two cases are the same, and it varies across every individual. So it's important for that reason to have what's known as a person-centered, strength-based approach. Work within the strengths of the individual when creating or giving them assistive technology. It's best to promote a person to continue to do a task rather than to just replace it in general. And you work with the capabilities of the individual to maintain independence and identity as well, because it's very difficult when a person might have been severely independent and stubbornly independent all their life to all of a sudden need all this assistance to function. And I guess with a person-centered approach is also to work within their goals. What do they want to do? What's important to them? So the devices also need to be adjustable for the individual. For example, some older adults may be comfortable with hearing voice reminders. However, others may prefer a musical tone, as voice reminders may cause confusion if a person hears But a lot of the people who do prefer vocal reminders, they prefer familiar voices. So whether it's their own voice or a family member instructing them. Whereas for a person who doesn't like that, they could get confused of, why can I hear my mother, it could be your mother, unfortunately, or why can I hear my carer in the room and I can't see them? Also, other things that can be personalized are the font sizes, the type of reminders, style of reminders, the language used, the number of reminders, the type of services engaged in, the length of time required to respond to a command. So having something that is extremely adaptable to the individual is most preferred. So that's everything. I hope you've gained a great overview and a very brief overview of what dementia is, the different types of dementia, and about assistive technology that can help people with dementia. Thank you.